Okay. Thank you. Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, members and whatever you want to call them of the Lanarkshire and Lothian Soaring Club. Used to be known as the Lanarkshire Soaring Club. And before that, there was flying went on at Tinto before the Lanarkshire Soaring Club even existed. I'm not going to say very much about paragliding in this, but I'll just start off with a little anecdote about paragliding, which is that paragliding could have been invented 7,000 years ago, because that's when the Chinese are first known to have manufactured silk fabric and silk threads. And the oldest piece of silk fabric that still exists is over 5,500 years ago. It was found in a grave of a child as part of the grave wrappings. So silk fabric has been being made for more than 5,500 years ago, 5,500 years, and that's all you need to build a paraglider. That and the knowledge. And that's the bit that was missing. There wasn't the materials.
So if it can last 7,000 years, why after 7 years to get a new one?
Well, it's only a little bit of it, and it's probably not very strong, right? Although silk is one of the strongest known natural fibres, so it's another reason why it could have been. So we could have been flying paragliders for 7,000 years if people had just known how to do it, or had the idea that you didn't need to remain connected to the ground, which is what the Chinese were doing. They were flying kites a lot, and they did have some man-carrying kites, but nobody seems to have had the idea that you could cut the cord and let them fly by themselves until the 20th century. Anyway, I'm going to talk about hang gliding primarily, and the history of hang gliding in Scotland. And if you'd lived in Glasgow in 1895, you might have seen a young man accompanied by a young woman making their way from the west end of Glasgow towards Helensburgh. And they're carrying a rather clumsy looking thing made of wooden poles, sailcloth and wires. And I'm absolutely sure he was asked where he was going fishing and where he was going to pitch his tent, because 100 years later, that's exactly the questions that hang glider pilots get asked when they're carrying their gliders. Here's some pictures from the kind of about the 1980s of hang gliders being transported. The young man in the picture, his name is Percy Pilcher, and the woman accompanying him is his sister Ella, and we'll say a wee bit more about her later. Percy Pilcher was born in Bath, so he's English, but we'll forgive him because he was half Scottish. His mother was Scottish. He was the youngest in a family of 3 sons, 2 daughters. His mother, Sophia Robertson, as I say, was Scottish, and his father, Thomas Pilcher, who was, at the time of Percy's death, had a slightly unusual career, and also age. He was 67 when his son was born. That he was the former curator of the British Museum Picture Gallery in Rome. Once upon a time, the British Museum had a picture gallery in Rome, and they employed somebody to be the curator, and Percy Pilcher's father had that job. Thomas Pilcher's father died in 1874, and his mother moved the family to Germany, but then she died in 1877. And the orphans then were brought to England by the eldest son, whose name was also Thomas, and he joined the army in order to get money, in order to be able to support his 3 surviving siblings, the youngest son having died shortly after he was born. And then Percy was sent to join the Navy, basically as soon as he was able. So at the age of 13, he was taken to see the admirals and was signed on as a midshipman, as I say, at the age of 13. And he rose through the ranks, and eventually he became a lieutenant. And he resigned his commission after 7 years voluntarily, although from his naval records, it looks like he didn't fit terribly well into the Navy. He had quite a lot of demerits on his record, none of which were particularly serious, but a lot of them were he just didn't really fit into this sort of hierarchical, very structured organisation. So he left the Navy after 7 years, so at the age of 20, and he came to Govan, where he studied engineering with the shipbuilders Randolph Elder and Company, who subsequently went on to be known better as the Fairfield Shipyard. Built some of the most famous warships in particular that the British Navy ever had. He gained further experience as a draftsman and a moulder, making ship models and moulding ship models out of wax with Cairns & Co. before moving on to Southampton, back down to the south of England, where he joined the Southampton Naval Works, working for a chap called John Biles, who goes on to become quite famous. Professor Sir John Harvard Biles. In fact, Pilcher, after he'd worked for him down in Southampton, Biles was appointed as Professor of Naval Architecture at Glasgow University, and Pilcher followed him up to Glasgow. So clearly he was a bit of a mentor of his. John Biles went on to be knighted for his contribution to naval architecture. He designed several transatlantic liners that were particularly fast at the time, and he was the Professor of Naval Architecture at Glasgow University for about 30 years. So really quite distinguished. So Pilcher has now moved up to Glasgow as an assistant lecturer in the Department of Naval Architecture. And he's quite keen on ships and, having been in the Navy perhaps, but he's also quite keen yachtsman. He owns his own yacht and he races it. But it's fairly obvious that his real passion was flight. But no, nobody really was flying then, but he was really interested in flight. He was accompanied to Glasgow by his sister Ella. I've already mentioned her. The two brothers and the two surviving brothers and two surviving sisters, they seemed to kind of form households together. Ella came and looked after Percy in the Glasgow house, and the other sister looked after the other brother. Both of them subsequently got married, but for at least part of their younger lives, they were effectively acting as housekeepers for their elder brothers who were earning money. But Ella clearly was an enthusiastic participant in Pilcher's flying experiments. She appears in practically every photograph that there is of Pilcher's gliders. She sewed up the sails of his gliders and possibly also his racing yacht. She was a very significant contributor to his flying experiments. Pilcher was very considerably influenced by the German gliding pioneer Otto Lilienthal. Lilienthal was an absolutely astonishingly successful glider pilot in the 1890s. He conducted between 2,000 and 2,500 gliding flights in aircraft that he had designed and built himself. He started his man-carrying experiments in 1891 when he was 43, so he'd obviously had a career of his own up till then, and he had enough money that he was able to build a hill. They called the Fliegberg, the flight hill, somewhere near Berlin, where he could conduct his flying experiments from. It's about 15 meters high, and he could take off in any direction because it's round. I remember us thinking years and years ago that we could just maybe adopt one of these bings that had been left following the end of mining in Glasgow. There was these big piles of shale, and we could maybe have had one of those landscaped to form something a bit like this. Well, Lilienthal was 100 years ahead of us. That's a photograph of Lilienthal flying from his Fliegberg. Lilienthal also went on to become the world's first aircraft manufacturer. He manufactured and sold at least 9, maybe 10 examples of this glider here that he called the normal Segelapparat, or the normal soaring apparatus, although by soaring he really just meant gliding, because nobody seemed to have got quite into gaining height. They all wanted to stay fairly close to the ground at this point in the development of flying. as I say, he had this particular example he sold to an Englishman in 1895, and it now belongs to the Science Museum in London. And his gliders are there's quite a lot of them still exist. Lilienthal's, he did experiment with different means of propulsion. He had the idea perhaps of making the wings flap or the wing tips flap. He built gliders that had almost like wing feathers at the ends, which could be flapped either by the pilot's legs or by carrying an engine. But none of these were very successful in comparison to his gliders, which were really remarkably successful. This is him demonstrating flight control by weight shift. This is why we call them hang gliders, because they were hang gliders. And also the limitations of weight shift when you're being suspended by your armpits in the glider. So your centre of gravity is not very far away from the centre of lift of the wing. And this is him applying a bit of left weight shift to correct a right turn. And so he, from the fact that we can see these photographs, he was also a pioneer of using photography to record these flying experiments that he'd done. And photographs and his accounts of his flying experiments were quite widely published. And we know that Pilcher read and corresponded with Lilienthal. Several of Lilienthal's gliders still survive. This is one of them. It's hanging in the Deutsche Technik Museum in Berlin, and there's a whole section of one floor that's devoted to photographs and other examples of Lilienthal's gliders. He's had much more attention paid to him in Germany than Pilcher managed to have anywhere in the UK, at least until quite recently. That's a picture I took in 2024 when I went to visit the Deutsche Technik Museum. Pilcher was building his gliders in his flat in the West End of Glasgow, and his sisters to sew them up. And his first glider he called the Bat, and that's what it looked like. Now it was not terribly successful, and you might be able to kind of guess why, because he's got far too much dihedral. This would make quite a good model glider because it would go in a straight line when you launched it. And we know he did build models, and it was sometime after he'd been building models, he scaled it up to man-carrying sizes or human-carrying sizes. So he's actually recorded as having commented that it was really very difficult to get, if it got out of wind or if a wee bit of a gust got under one wing, it was extremely difficult to get the wing back down again. So that was his Bat Mark 1. His Bat Mark 2 is a little bit less dihedral, but still really too much. He'd also increased the size of the tail, which was partly Lilienthal's advice to him that he would need a tail. Can't see it terribly well in that photograph, but he did. He visited Lilienthal in 1895 and in 1896. He flew one of Lilienthal's gliders in 1896, and his designs after that, which this is not after that, this is before it. This is a glider, this is his sort of third major evolution of his designs, which he called the Bat. No, sorry, the first one was the Bat. This is called the Beetle. I'm not quite sure why, but you can see that now we've got the center. The pilot is hanging quite a little bit lower down relative to the wing, and there's a lot less dihedral, like almost no dihedral at all. The wings are almost in a plane with each other, and also he's designed a curved airfoil shape to the wing to get a bit more lift. So the Beetle wasn't particularly successful. And he then built a glider that he called the Gull, which had about 50% more sail area than this. And it was too big. He couldn't really cope with it. And it was just because the area was too large. And he crashed it quite early on and decided that no, he needed to do something slightly scaled down. And by this time he had visited Lilienthal. So his most successful design, which is called the Hawk. And this is Pilcher's Hawk, heavily restored, hanging in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, up in the ceiling. And if you look at it, well, if you know that the fabric had all disappeared while it was in storage, this wasn't very well looked after at all. And and quite a lot of the woodwork had to be repaired. The wires are mostly still original, but it's clearly been quite heavily restored. But this was Pilcher's Hawk, and it was pretty successful. It's similar to Lilienthal's design, but it's not a copy. There's several distinct differences about it, but he was pretty successful. He had had successful flights in both the Bat Mark II and the Beetle, not in the Gull, and he had very successful flights in the Hawk. That picture, in fact, the previous picture, if I go back to it, I've said that's at Auchinsail Farm. Well, it's easy to determine exactly where that picture was taken because that farmhouse still exists. And it looks exactly like that. I did make an attempt to recreate this photograph using a modern glider, but the now owner of Auchinsail Farm doesn't want anybody to know what he's doing and won't let people in his garden. So I wasn't able wasn't allowed to do that. So Pilcher has built his Hawk. He's visited Lilienthal, he's flown one of Lilienthal's gliders. And the fact that Pilcher spoke German, I mean, he'd spent 3 years in his youth living in Germany, and he'd obviously learned German. That must have assisted his communication with Lilienthal. We know that he corresponded with him as well as visiting him. So we've got his gliders, including the Hawk, and he managed a number of extended flights on the slopes above that. The reason he was carrying his glider towards Helensburgh, should have mentioned, it's probably obvious to gliding pilots that you're looking for gentle slopes that face into the prevailing wind. And that's what he found out towards Cardross near Helensburgh. There were some fields with relatively gentle slopes that face kind of southwest into the prevailing wind, and that was why he was out there. And he was able to make quite a number of extended gliding flights above the slopes of Cardross, and learning how to both take off, steer in a reasonably straight line, and then land. Now, we all know that you need to slow down and flare like a stall when you come into land. That's only obvious once you know how. It wasn't obvious to these guys. They talk about the difficulty of landing, and not understanding about the slowing down bit and bringing it to a halt just as you land. So it is interesting. So in November 1896, which is later in the year after Pilcher had made his second visit to Germany, Lilienthal died in a gliding accident. He was doing one of his fairly regular flights off one of his hills, and he, from the accident reports that came in subsequently, he appears to have stalled and basically hit the ground before his glider recovered from the stall. So fundamentally, not enough pitch stability in his glider, and lack of pitch stability has been issues with pitch stability have continued their hang gliding ever since Lilienthal's day. By 1897, Pilcher had moved to England, and he was seeking support for his flying development, and he was keen to. His idea was he wanted to build a powered aircraft. Now remember, this is several years before the Wright brothers successfully demonstrated their flight, and he designed a triplane, of which this is a model because there's no remaining artifacts of this glider still exist other than some drawings of it. But he designed this triplane, and he'd also designed the engine that was going to drive it. And he'd formed a company with another engineer to build lightweight engines that would be suitable for mounting in aircraft. And he was planning to give a demonstration flight in September 1899, in the grounds of Stanford Hall, which by weird coincidence has relatively recently become the UK military centre for rehabilitation. That's where they send military soldiers and airmen and sailors who've been injured and require rehabilitation therapy. Stanford Hall is now the centre of that. In a field near Stanford Hall, he was going to demonstrate his glider being towed into flight because it's very flat. And apparently, the reason for that was because his crankshaft, the crankshaft of this new engine, failed the week before he was due to give the demonstration. But he was hoping to get money from investors and also encourage supporters of his activities. So he decided that he would make a gliding demonstration flight in his Hawk in this field beside Stanford Hall, being towed, probably I think behind horses in this case, although he sometimes was man-towed as well into the air. And up he was towed on the 30th of September. And unfortunately, possibly due to the fact that it had been quite heavy rain overnight, and both the glider and the tow rope had become saturated with water and hence quite a bit heavier, that might have been enough to have caused the structural failure of the tail boom of his glider, which broke, and without that tail structure he crashed into the ground, and 2 days later he died. So that's in a period of 3 years, the two most successful aircraft designers and builders that had ever lived to that time had both died in flying accidents. Pilcher having become the first aircraft accident victim in the UK. Something I have missed on the way past, while he was down in England, we not know for sure exactly when his sister Ella first flew his glider, but she flew it at least once, probably both in Scotland and in England, and a female cousin, Dorothy, of his, also flew in his glider when they were down in England. So they became the first two female pilots that had ever been in the UK, and that meant that there were twice as many female pilots as there were male pilots at that moment in time. The stats haven't looked as good ever since.
I wonder how much input they had into the actual design.
No way of telling. We know that there was a lot of sort of physical input into it from Ella in actually manufacturing bits of the glider and doing the sail, stitching the sail. Percy was very skilled draftsman. His drawings that he left behind are really excellent, with no evidence to suggest that Ella had any particular skills in that kind of thing at the time. We know that she did complete her school education, and that was one of the reasons why Thomas, the elder brother, and Percy went to work, so that their two sisters could complete their education, because in those days in England it was paid for. All education was being paid for. But we don't have any... unlike the relationship perhaps between Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his wife Margaret, where it's quite clear that she had a very strong influence in the artistic output of what he produced, we don't have any good evidence that, other than the physical construction that she was involved in, that Ella had much influence over his glider designs. So that's us up to 1899, and we've just had the second of these two pioneers die in fatal accidents. By coincidence, in 1890, sorry, I thought I was showing you that. That's the memorial to Percy Pilcher that sits in the field where he crashed, right adjacent to Stanford Hall. You can see it's pretty flat. You can also see that there's now wind turbines in the background, although it's flat in England. And this was erected by the Royal Aeronautical Society in 1910. It's quite a substantial memorial. It says on one face, Percy Pilcher, pioneer of aviation, fell here September the 30th, 1899, and on the opposite side it's got engraved Icaro Alteri, or another Icarus. So even in 1910, he was really quite regarded with considerable notice to having something like this erected with his name on it. And in 1911, he was one of the first group of engineers to be elected to the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame, which happened for the first time in 1911. It's happened most years since, but he was one of the first group to be elected. So at the very early years of the 20th century, he really had been recognised for his pioneering contribution. That kind of all disappeared for nearly the next 100 years, and it's only relatively recently that people have begun to recognise again how much of a contribution he made. So by coincidence, in 1899, the Wright brothers began their flying experiments. They noted both Pilcher's and Lilienthal's prior activities in the things that they wrote about what they were doing. One of the key innovations that they did was they recognised kind of sooner than Pilcher and Lilienthal that you needed a better form of control than shifting your weight. The problem with weight shift is that the forces you're trying to control in an aircraft are proportional to the square of your speed. So if you go twice as fast, you need 4 times as much force to control what you're doing. Whereas the weight that you're trying to use to control it is not altered by the speed you're going at. So the Wright brothers had recognised quite early on that, as well as their experiments with wind tunnels to try and develop improved airfoils to make the aircraft more efficient, they also needed a way to control the flight of the aircraft. So this is the first flight at Kitty Hawk of the Wright Flyer, and you can see that they've got 2 tailplanes that are actually in front of the pilot, providing pitch control, and they've got 2 rudders at the back providing yaw control, and they've got wing warping, which you can't see the wires, but that's how they control roll. So they had separated out pitch, yaw and roll, and they had implemented mechanisms to apply control in all those 3 dimensions, which, as we've seen from the movements in the air that Lilienthal was making, that neither Pilcher nor Lilienthal had got as far as that. So basically, after the Wright brothers' success in 1903, almost all aviation was focused on speed and power. And it didn't help, or it did help, depending on how you want to look at it, that we had 2 world wars, which both had enormous impact on aviation, but again, all focused on making things go faster and faster and heavier and higher and all the rest of it. And even sailplanes, which were being developed at that time, notably in Germany, because after the First World War, German aviation industry was suppressed because of the Allies' restrictions that they put on German developments and things that might become warplane developments or warlike developments between what turned out to be the 2 wars. They did a lot of work with sailplanes, but again, it was mostly focused on making things faster and heavier. And it wasn't really until 1948 when Francis and Gertrude Regalo patented this, which is a biconical flexible kite. Now, it kind of looks as if there might be stiffening along the leading edges there, but there isn't. This is just fabric. So in a sense, it's the first paraglider because there's no structural stiffening in it at all. So this they patented in 1948. The patent was actually issued in 1952, but they submitted the patent in 1948. And they noted in the patent application that aside from using it for kite, you could add stiffening to it, to the leading edges of the keel, and they also said you could potentially use this for soaring. So they had forecast the potential for using it as much more widely than just a toy had occurred to them back as when they first produced it. NASA were very interested at this point in the 1950s in improving or coming up with a better way to manage splashdowns of spacecraft. This was a Gemini capsule splashdown. That was the second of the American space missions after the first one. And but you can see them using a nice big round parachute here to bring it down. And working out where it was going to splash down was not easy. Because they didn't know, they hadn't done it very often, so they didn't know exactly what was going on. So choosing when it was actually going to begin its re-entry was a little bit of a lottery, and then how far it would get before you opened the parachute. It's all a bit uncertain. And so NASA had the idea that, maybe we could use these flexible, steerable parachute designs so that we could reduce the size that we would have to have the ships out in the ocean. And so they did a lot of work on Regalo designs, including building this. This is a towed, you can see the tow rope there, although it was occasionally released and glided into land. A towed Regalo winged, I don't know what you would call it. It's not really it's a glider, but what you can't really very readily see in the photograph is that the pilot who's sitting in this here is holding a control column stick in front of them. And by means of gears that go underneath and then back up, they steer it by pushing the stick forward, just like you would fly an airplane. So there's quite a lot of mechanism required in order to connect the wing here to the pilot at the bottom. But it flew, and of course that's not going to become a re-entry device because you can't fill that up into a small space in a capsule. But they also developed this one, which they called the Fleep, for flying Jeep, right? And it has an engine at the back, can't see very easily, but this is a four-wheeled powered microlight, except it's really heavy and not terribly efficient. But this was being built in the late 50s, and no, but it was a kind of dead end. NASA lost interest primarily because they got better at weather forecasting, better at modelling re-entries, and they decided that the simplicity of a round parachute exceeded the potential for being able to steer the Rogallo-style device. So that was how things went on until somewhere in the 1960s, California, laid-back lifestyle in California, and people started to get interested in the idea of low and slow flight. And they kind of went the opposite way from fast and speed and engines and all the rest of it. And amongst others, a chap by the name of Richard Miller built this, which he called the bamboo butterfly. And it is literally made of bamboo, but not butterfly wings, it's made of polythene, stuck together with duct tape. And as you can see, he is hanging in the traditional Lilienthal or Pelcher manner and shifting his weight in exactly the same way as Lilienthal and Pelcher did in the 1890s. And the whole ethos here was trying to fly ultra lightweight, ultra portable, at least on the top of a car, slow flight, and not flying any higher than you were willing to fall. So in Australia at the same time, some showmen who had developed a kite towed show, water skied, right? So water ski, and they used to do water ski jumping behind a speedboat, and people realised that if you carried a kite, you could make these jumps much bigger. And they then commissioned a chap called John Dickinson, who's an Australian, to build them a better kite wing so that they could make bigger jumps. And Dickinson knew about the Rogallo wing design, and he thought that he could improve it by suspending the pilot below the wing on a swing seat, which he says he got the idea from pushing his daughter on a child's swing. So here he is flying the Dickinson wing, having taken off, pulled behind the speedboat with his water ski. He's sitting on a swing, which is now suspended from up here, so you can see how much further away from the glider his centre of gravity is, so he's got much more lever arm to provide input control. He's got a triangular control frame in front of him, bracing wires to hold it in place, three main tubes and a cross tube. That's a hang glider. That was the first hang glider, designed by John Dickinson in Australia. It was so obviously superior to anything that had done before that design just took over the world almost immediately, conveniently forgetting that Dickinson had designed it, and indeed labelling it as a Rogallo. Although, and indeed, the biconical wing may not even have been first invented by the Rogallos, but they definitely had a patent for it. And that was where hang gliding manufacture began, with gliders like that. Now, my first contact with hang gliders began in 1974, when I accidentally discovered these NASA research papers in the Glasgow University Engineering Library. They had a complete set of all the NASA research, NACA and NASA research papers, and I accidentally stumbled across those pictures of the Parasev and similar, and testing full-sized hang gliders in the Langley Wind Tunnel at full size. And I got quite interested in this idea, and I was struggling to come up with a topic for my final year project. And I also came across and this is the art of original thinking, is picking up two different new ideas but forgetting where you heard them, right? The second idea was some mathematical work that had been done on optimizing the design of sailplanes for thermal cross-country soaring. Because, as we will all know, there are two competing factors here. The first one is that you want to be able to have short radius turns, efficient short radius turns, so that you can stay in a small thermal while gaining height. But then once you've got to the top of your thermal, you'd really like to have really skinny, high aspect ratio wings to glide a long way to the next. And there's obviously a balance you can strike between which of those you're most interested in. And some mathematics had been done which sort of led to a conclusion as to how you would optimize the design of a sailplane. And I thought there was enough theoretical information now available from the testing that NASA had done in order to apply this theory to hang gliders. And so my final year project was titled that in 1978, when I published it, the thermal soaring potential of hang gliders. Now, in 1978, to the best of my knowledge, nobody had flown a cross-country flight in Scotland. Cross-country flights had been done, but none in Scotland. And but I'm glad to say that I had demonstrated that in 1978, actually these hang gliders might be quite good at this cross-country soaring as long as small thermals are more common than big ones. Now, nobody knew what the thermal distribution was. We don't still really know exactly what the thermal distribution was, but if small thermals that hang gliders could use were more common than the big ones that sailplanes tended to be using in those days, then actually hang gliders would have a chance to get to their next small thermal before they hit the ground, and therefore they might be going to be quite good. So I then had to give a talk about my project to my engineering final year class, and I did. And it was an extremely successful talk because everybody else was doing topics that were relatively tiny in comparison to, not tiny as in unimportant, but small pieces of aircraft or the subtle changes to the control of helicopter rotor design and stuff like that. And I was the only person who was talking about a whole airplane. And loads of questions, right? What was it like? How heavy were they to carry? Had I done it, right? And of course, the answer to all of these questions was no idea, because all I've seen is pictures, right, of gliders to this date, right? So a year later, I've joined a postgraduate training scheme, and I've got, apart from visiting and working with 5 different engineering companies, I've also got to give a talk to these engineering students. Now, they're not aeronautical engineering students, but they're engineers. So I've got one I prepared earlier, right? But I also know all the questions I'm going to be asked. And so I thought, well, I better find out a bit more about this. So I went back to Brian Harrison, who was running Scott Kites, who were both a hang gliding school and a manufacturer at the time, and who had given me photographs that I'd used in my original talk. And I said to him, right, can I have a go at this gliding lark? And he said, yeah, sure. So I came down to Tinto. So in February 1979, I found myself standing in snow showers, literally, right, sheltering with the glider's nose down in the ground, sheltering in behind the glider as the snow came through, and in between the snow showers, being tethered. This is a much better day for being tethered, but being tethered like that with three people holding tethers, Brian Harrison holding the nose with 2 ropes, one to control pitch, and 2 students holding the wings on either side, not as high as that above the ground, but basically that was my first actual lifted off the ground experience with a hang glider. Seated in those days rather than hanging in this semi-prone position that we now teach people in. But we're still using this teaching method now. But that was my first hands-on, so to speak, experience. So my second training day was a bit more conventional. I actually, nobody else holding onto the glider, just me. Bottom landing field at Tinto. I think you're all probably familiar with that. There's just enough of a slope at the back edge of it to actually get across off the ground, land before the fence because they didn't glide very far, and we were flying things that looked quite like that with a king post, much less curvy much more Rogallo-like, as I'll show you in the next picture. So that was day 2, learning to kind of steer this big umbrella, which never seemed to want to point in the right direction. Day 3, we're gradually moving a bit further up the hill on the south side of Green Hill before the trees got big. And the flights are lasting a little bit longer and beginning to get some little turns in. And then towards the end of the day, we've maybe moved 50 feet up the hill. And Billy Borland, who was my instructor at the time, said, right, this time, Angus, when you take off, you have to turn right, very careful not to turn back into the hill. So you're doing a sailing-like tack or crab along the front of the hill. When you get to the dry stone wall, which is still there, turn back to the left and come back this way and then land at the bottom. And so I took off, and there's a wee bit of breeze blowing. I'm having to concentrate quite hard. I'm making sure I don't get the tip too close to the hill. Move along, get to the dry stone wall, turn round and come back again. And I am utterly astonished to discover that I'm about 10 feet higher up than the people I'd been standing beside when I took off. And I can still remember what that felt like. It literally sends a prickle up the back of my neck. I had, through my skill, right, right, I harnessed the power of the wind, and I gained height. And it that's the moment, that's why I fly, because of that moment of gaining height and feeling as if I had done it all under my control. And of course I hadn't at all. I'd just done what I was told, and been very fortunate with the weather. I was even more fortunate with the weather the next day we went out to fly. We went to a hill that I haven't flown since, most of the way back to Edinburgh, and the weather conditions just turned out to be utterly extraordinary because there was a bit of wave set up, and this meant that the wind wasn't too strong, but if you took off from the nice curving edge of this hill and flew out over the landing field, you stayed up, even seated in a glider that looked like that. And as long as you stayed kind of within the bounds of this large landing field, you stayed up, significantly above the takeoff height in the hill. And there was probably about 8 or 10 gliders out there flying up and down, staying up. And after 15 minutes, I got freezing cold because longest flight to date, 1 minute, right? And all the rest of it had been running up and down the hill. And I'm now sitting in this 20-mile-an-hour breeze and freezing. So I land at the bottom, but boy, am I excited. Fold the glider up, run back up the top of the hill. And Brian Harrison says to me, "You did really well. I think maybe you're ready to move on to a more advanced glider." Okay. So this is what we call the standard gallo. It's the sail, as you can see, is attached at the leading edge and on the keel, and you're just like Dickinson had designed. You're hanging in a swing seat underneath the centre of lift of the glider and using this triangular control frame to control it. The one difference from his design is we've added a king post, because it turned out that if you put the nose of the glider down in the wind, there was nothing to hold it up, and the cross tubes tended to break, so that was why the king post was added. So a floating keel pocket this glider was going to have, and here's an example of a glider with a floating keel pocket, and it's me that's flying it. I may not be recognisable, but honestly, that's me. This glider was designed for Jimmy Potts, who was a very early microlight pilot in Scotland. He's still about. And he wanted to fly like Baron Manfred von Richthofen. And so he designed this glider. I don't have a colour photograph of it. It's pretty obviously going to be red wings, white panels, and black square German crosses in it. And this is an example of a floating keel pocket design. You can see that the sail at the root here is not directly attached to the keel anymore. It's attached to this bit of cloth here, the keel pocket, raising it away from the keel, and that makes it much easier to turn. The funny thing about turning hang gliders is the first thing that happens when you put your weight across, shift your weight in a hang glider, you put more weight on one wing. Let's say we're trying to turn right, okay? So we move our weight across to the right. The first thing that happens when you put more weight on the right wing is it flies faster. And so you get adverse yaw. And then the glider realizes that you've lent it over, and the adverse yaw automatically turns itself into a roll in the other direction. But the very first reaction of a hang glider to weight shift, applying weight shift, is adverse yaw.
And do they all still do that?
They do all still do that, yes. It's amazingly how quickly you get used to it as a pilot, except when you start to fly fast for the first time, particularly on tow, because you've got so used to the kind of response rate of gliders and relatively modest inputs that if you get on aerotow in particular, where you're going to be pulled at quite high airspeed, then when you want to try and correct your position behind the tug, adjusting to the fact that the first thing that happens when you apply the control is adverse yaw does take a little bit, and pilot-induced oscillations definitely happen. So that was me flying this Red Baron Olympus design. The other things about it is you can see this bit of cross that's stuck on each leading edge. This has got 3 deflexor wires that were called, or they're supposed to be really anti-deflexing wires. They're to make the leading edges straighter. So you've got wires that you can tension below, above and out in front to make the leading edges stay straighter, which means that the sail itself remains a bit tighter. You've also got a bit more wing surface at the tips than you had in the Regalos, a bit of roached tip going on. But still what's known as a single surface glider. The cross tubes here are still in the airflow. There's only a tiny little bit of leading edge pocket there of double surface, otherwise the wing is just a single surface wing. So during the 1980s, right, so I'll say one other thing. So that's me. I've now mastered soaring. This floating keel pocket wasn't this glider. It's a slightly lower performance one that I had my first floating keel pocket go on, so that was early in 1979. By summer 1979, I discovered that these thermals that were actually allegedly a myth, because pilots in the Lanarkshire Soaring Club thought that they'd read somewhere that Dennis Pagan, who's an author you may have heard of, an American author of books on flying and paragliding, hang gliding, and also weather, he was alleged to have said that you didn't get usable thermals north or south of 55 degrees. Now, even in the 1970s, this should have been obviously not true, because the pilots who were doing their plummets from the top to the bottom at Tinto had already observed that it got quite turbulent in the summer. Well, anyway, there still had been no cross-country flights done in Scotland by that time. But by summer 1979, the Scottish Open hang gliding competition, which was then an annual event, was taking place in Glenshee, and I went up to observe, and I had my first thermal flight beside Mount Blair, kind of halfway down Glenshee, on a day which was completely blue, not a hint of a cloud in the sky. And the competition task that day that had been set, I wasn't taking part in the competition, I'm a novice, right? But the competition task that had been set was to carry a glider to the top of Mount Blair, task 1. Part 2, well, they were a lot lighter and we were a lot younger. Part 2, take off and fly as fast as you can until you cross the road at the north side of Mount Blair. And then slow down and see how long you can stay in the air before you spot land in the field just across the road. So speed run, duration of spot landing is the competition. And some of the people who took off discovered that there were thermals, despite the fact that it was completely blue. And Andy Fawcett, who some of you may have heard of, or at least Heidi Fawcett, his wife, this was the last time he ever entered the competition. Because when he took off and discovered he could go up, he completely lost interest in going down to the bottom landing field, and he spent the whole afternoon basically at 5,500 feet, thermaling by smell, because you could smell the new mown hay at 5,500 feet. In between the thermals, completely odorless air, clean and smell, but you flew into a bit of, you smell the hay, you knew there was a thermal. And the fact that there were blades of grass being wafted past him. He said he caught 2, right? The thermals were so strong. So he gave up flying in competitions. He would never be going to be told again to do a stupid task on a day that turned out to be absolutely brilliant. So I managed nearly an hour soaring. Never got above the top of Mount Blair, but I was kind of basically just about managed to stay level with it. And by the time I landed, I was completely wiped out. But yeah, thermals definitely exist. And by the time we'd got later in 1979, I did, well, only the second ever cross country that had been done from Tinto. There had been a prize awarded, I think it was to Jimmy Potts in 1977 for a 3-mile cross country. You can check the numbers because they're on the club trophy for the first ever cross country that had been done, something like 3 miles. And I did, because I did write it down, 5.7 miles. I set a record. I might have, but it's 5.7 it says in my log when I double checked it. So that was a gain height and a thermal on Tinto, and then think, well, why would I want to go back? I can just head off downwind, and oh my goodness, I cruise gently past Big Tinto, having taken off at the Green Hill end, cruise down and I cruise on, and I can see hills on the other side of the Clyde. I think I might just about be able to get to them. And then I realised, no, I'm going to come in short of that. So I'm thinking to myself, right, okay, it's important that I line myself up to land into wind, no drift. Why am I moving across the ground so fast? Why am I moving so fast? And it's because I have landed beautifully directly downwind. Because it was the first time I'd ever landed away from takeoff, and all my other landings had always been made with the hill behind me, and it never occurred to me that now that I've gone cross country, the hill behind me means that it's downwind. So lessons to be learned for everybody. So that was my early experience. But in the meantime, in the early 1980s, the BBC commissioned a drama that had been set in the 1890s, and the hero was quite adventurous, and the scriptwriters had the idea that they knew about Pilcher's flying experiments, and they thought they might try and get him to do those things, right? So they built a replica glider, and you might be able to recognise that's the quarry takeoff at Tinto. The quarry's just behind us. And here we have a mixture of hang glider pilots of the 1980s and made-up people from the 1890s wearing their flat caps, and some film crew people. And believe it or not, that's me. A lot more hair and a big bushy beard that I had in those days. That's Donald Mackenzie, for those who recognise him. That's Andy Fawcett. And that's Margaret Armstrong there. And I haven't been able to positively identify any of the other ones, but I'm happy to be given any clues by anybody. There are a few more photographs. I don't, facing the other way, that one? I don't think it is, because there's another picture at a different angle, which Steve will be able to show you because he's got access to them all. These photographs were taken by Lawrence Watterson, who was a member of the Lanarkshire Club for many years in the 1980s. He came along because he was interested in flying, but because he was a diabetic, he had never thought he would ever be able to fly, but he was so interested, he came along every weekend, and he always brought with him 2 rucksacks full of thermos flasks full of boiling water and loads of biscuits. And he carried them up to the top of the hill. Wind, rain, lots of rain apparently in those days, I remember, and shine, and we would sit behind the wall sheltering from the rain and the weather and drink Lawrence's coffee and chat with him and eat his biscuits. And he took hundreds of photographs of the flying that went on. And those photographs, he has died, but the photographs got Steve Brown, who happens to be here tonight, he was responsible for digitising most all, I'm not quite sure. And Robert was involved as well. So Steve's the kind of keeper of this archive of photographs of that. Well, I've got a CD. I've got a CD with them all on it. But anyway, this is one of the photographs that Lawrence took of the Pilcher replica. Andy Fawcett, who was one of the more experienced pilots and also quite daring, he test flew it. test hopped it, and it didn't fly terribly well. And it was very difficult to control it didn't have very much dihedral. It was quite difficult to control and roll, and it was difficult to get the centre of gravity right, and the wind didn't really seem to cooperate either, so it didn't work terribly well. And I've never been able to remind myself now what the BBC series was called, and I can't find any sign of it online, but there must be somewhere in the BBC records of this filming that went on in the 1980s. So it won't come as much of a surprise to you guys that flying cross country in a hang glider is the most intellectually demanding, difficult thing I've ever done. And it's the only thing I've ever found that's worth spending, well, the longest flight I've ever had was 7 hours, fully focused and concentrated in the air at once. Nothing else I've ever done, has been worth that much effort. At the end of that 7-hour flight, which I did in Switzerland, in conjunction with a pilot from New Zealand, and we both ended up landing at the end of the day when the lift had all gone in a field in Switzerland. And we both came into land, and both of us, when we landed, our legs didn't work anymore. We were just so exhausted after all that time there. But it is extraordinary, and the feeling that you get, and the opportunity to fly and to do things that people who stand on the ground can't do, is just fantastic. One of my most memorable flying experiences happened in Iceland. When I had been out there to try and explore some new flying sites with Icelandic pilots that I got to know quite well. Christian Richter, who came to fly in the Scottish Open because it was the nearest hang gliding competition to Iceland. So he decided he would enter one year because he knew that there would be more to be learned from experience. So he turned up, he turned up at Glasgow Airport with his hang glider and phoned up the then secretary of the Scottish Hang Gliding Federation and said, "How do I get to Glenshee?" But it was the fact that he'd been able to get there at all was even more remarkable, because he had asked Icelandair if his hang glider would fit in a 737, and they said yes. And he said, "Are you sure?" And they said yes. So he turned up at Keflavik Airport with his glider, and it didn't fit. For most people, that would probably have been the end. He would have had to have broken the glider, travelled next week or something like that, because they wouldn't have daily flights in those days from Iceland. But not Christian. Christian, who was a salesman par excellence, he persuaded Icelandair that because they were the cause of the problem, he could have folded the glider up shorter, except they told him he didn't need to. They would have to get it on the plane somehow. And so, in probably the only case in history, an airline agreed to transport a hang glider inside the cabin. They folded down 20 rows of seats, put the seats all forward, and then strapped the glider in with safety belts and flew it to Glasgow inside 737. So I had a flight in Iceland, subsequent to having met Christian after that experience. I went out to Iceland, and we had a funny day when I said, "Look, we've had really poor weather while I've been here. It's not uncommon in Iceland. It's a bit like Scottish weather, only worse." And it's usually the opposite, actually, because the average width of a depression across the Atlantic, it's either getting Iceland or it's getting us, or it's probably getting both of us at the edges. So this was the day before I was due to come home, and it was by far the best weather that we'd seen. And I said, "Can nobody get out to fly today? This looks like a better day." Oh, they were all busy until lunchtime before anybody could get out. Okay, so we'll go to the hill that the wind's on, except the wind was at least 45 degrees off this hill, which was quite unexpected. So we went to the hill that was 45 degrees different direction, and it was 45 degrees off the other way. This is really strange. So we had a third hill, which was kind of somewhere in between, and it was not really on it either, but we could just get off and squeeze round the front of the hill and get onto the bit that was now facing the wind and get soaring. And my flight plan was I was going to fly one hill downwind from where I'd taken off and land on top, because I had left the bag for my battens on top of that hill the previous day when we'd had a top to bottom flight, and when I got to the bottom I discovered I'd left my pattern bag on the top. So that was my plan. I was going to land on this hill behind. It's about a couple of miles downwind. Well, by the time I got to that hill 2 miles downwind, I was at about 5,000 feet. And I was not going to come down to land. I could buy another leather bag. I wasn't going to come back down to land it. And also I could work out what was going on by now. And what was happening was that there was a sea breeze. But north of Reykjavik, where we were, the sea breeze and the land breeze were at about 45 degrees to each other. So they weren't hitting face to face, but they were at coming at each other at an angle that meant that there was a sloping sea breeze, partial sea breeze front. But as you went further round the island of Iceland to the south coast, I could now see a sea breeze front, the likes of which you see in meteorological textbooks. It was just absolutely classic curtain cloud hanging down, and it went on forever along the south coast of Iceland. And I'm circling up here in this lift above Reykjavik. I get to about 8,500 feet above Reykjavik, and I'm thinking that's the best sea breeze front I'll ever see in my life. I could fly 100 miles along it. I can see 100 miles. I could fly along it. But there are a couple of problems. One of them is that the first part of it, which is not quite so obvious that the lift is great because it's still this bit where the sea breeze is not faced, head on. It's across what I know to be unlandable lava fields. They're not hot anymore, but they're basically relatively new lava, and it's just not, you'd never get back out, even if you could find somewhere to land. And the second thing is, I'm due on a plane home at 5 o'clock the next morning. And I haven't got a mobile phone or a radio or any way to contact anybody. So if I did find myself landing out there, and my Icelandic is terrible, although most Icelanders speak quite good English. So I decided I was going to have to just give up this enormous flight that I could have managed and just relax. So I did. And in relaxing, I was able to actually take in the experience in a way which I rarely do because I'm usually so focused on trying to achieve a competition task or whatever. And I found myself at 8,500 feet, right above Reykjavik, capital of Iceland, in utterly clear air. No difficulty staying up because there's this big, broad area of lift that's keeping me up. I'm not in danger of being sucked into the cloud. It's just keeping me up rather nicely. And I'm looking down at what looks like a model village. I can see people moving about. I can see little tiny toy cars driving. I can see model aeroplanes taking off from the airfield in Reykjavik, a mile and a half below me, and beside the toy boats that are in the harbour. And I'm just completely separated. Can't hear a thing. It's just completely silent. My glider circles along. And there are a few little raindrops occasionally falling out of this cloud above me. And when they land on my gloves, they splash and freeze instantly. So I get the occasional frozen splash with super cold rain has fallen onto my gloves and going, boop, it's ice. Just little splashes of ice. So I, having relaxed and decided I can't make use of this lift, it's time now to leave it. I'm going to fly down the main road towards the international airport at Reykjavik, but stopped well before I got there. And my Vario did not bleep after I left this lift. I had the smoothest air I've ever experienced from 8,000 feet all the way down to sea level. One blip, I took a little detour across the aluminium smelter that sits on the coast there, and it went beep. That was it. I just glided down in this completely still air and a smooth air and landed beside the sea. So that's the kind of reason why I've continued to fly hang gliders. Now, I did say at the start that Lilienthal probably died through lack of pitch stability in his glider. Although his glider designs have been tested, modern testing has been done, and they are stable, but not as stable as they might have been, as they could be, let's put it that way. And structural failure was what did for pilcher. So how do we deal with both of those issues today, and have done for the past sort of 25 years? This is the original version of load testing on a hang glider. Hang glider upside down from the ceiling and put sandbags on it to represent the flight loads, and hopefully it doesn't break. It works reasonably well, but it's hard to know where you ought to put and how much weight you ought to put on because you're really guessing the weight distribution on the glider, and it becomes completely impossible to do that when you have a wing that's got double surface like this one. You can see that you can't see the cross tubes now. They are there, but you can't see them because they're completely inside the sail. The red undersurface here is the undersurface sail. It only touches the top surface when it goes white at the back near the trailing edge. So all of the cross tubes and the structure that makes the physical structure of the glider is now contained inside the sail. There's no king post. You'd hardly be able to see it in this case, but there isn't one because it's now got carbon fibre and alloy cross tube junction in the centre, all contained within the wing. So you can't do that kind of load test on that kind of glider, because if you put the weights on the undersurface, you're definitely not reproducing what's going on when your glider's flying, because most of the force that's applied to any aerofoil is on the upper surface, not the lower surface. It's about 2-to-1 roughly ratio. So there's twice as much suction happening as there is pressure underneath. So you couldn't test a hang glider like that by doing the kind of load testing that we did. So what do we do nowadays? And the answer is that we do this. Here is a load test being done on a modern hang glider. This is the test rig that the BHPA, or BHGA, now BHPA own. And in fact, that's Mark Dale, who used to be the BHPA's technical manager, working with it. And this test rig is built on the chassis of a Chevrolet truck, 6-litre engine with nitrous oxide injection for a bit of extra power. We'll see why you might want that later. And the rig itself was designed by a very impressive aeronautical and mechanical engineer. The chap who's talking in the bottom right-hand corner here is Tim Swaite. He's the owner of Airwave gliders nowadays, and this is an Airwave glider. Avian gliders. This is an Avian glider that's being tested. It's one of his newer designs that's being tested. The Riot, which is intended for power flying. So he's talking about that, but it goes into far much technical detail, and it's too difficult to sound to work. So you just have to listen to my commentary instead. So here we have the angle of attack of the glider can be adjusted. There's an aircraft landing leg actuator, electric motor, which joins this support strut to the control frame of the glider and allows you, while you're driving along, to change the angle of attack. And what we're doing here is we're built a wind tunnel. But most wind tunnels, the tunnel stands still and you blow air past the model. In this case, we drive the glider into the wind and create the same effect. What you need for this is, apart from a powerful truck to get it up to the kind of speeds that are required for load testing, you also need a smooth runway, and that's proving a wee bit more difficult. This runway is a bit undulating. And it's also a bit short, so we're going to have a bit more. We used to use the longer runway at this. It's called an airfield called Rufforth, which has also got a gliding club at it. But after some incidents on their gliding club runway, they have set a 25-mile-an-hour limit. They won't let any vehicles travel at more than 25 miles an hour on their main runway, and we want to travel at 70 miles an hour maximum. And so we still have to. We have noticed that the aircraft tend to land and take off a bit faster than 25 miles an hour, but anyway. So here we are doing a pitch test on this glider. It's got quite good acceleration. It even manages to beat the drone that's following it. And you can probably just see that as it's driving along, the nose angle is being reduced. And we're measuring, trying to drive at kind of relatively constant speed at the moment, and then adjust the angle, the pitch angle, and there's a computer in the truck which is recording data from the load cells that are in here. Right? It's really quite sophisticated. It's a two-axis load cell. Lift, drag, and pitching moment are all being measured by this load cell, which was designed for us and for the German hang gliding manufacturers, Paragliding Association, the DHV, and also the American Hang Gliding Manufacturers Association. We all bought, actually he built 4 of them because he built one for himself as well, and Mark West, who designed it and had it manufactured, he's the only person that I know who's got an Oscar sitting on their mantelpiece. not for acting in his case, but for technical contribution. He was involved with Hollywood for quite a long time, designing camera rigs and model rigs. In the days when you couldn't use computer graphics to do everything from scratch, you had to film a model and then do the computer graphics manipulation afterwards. He built the camera mounts that were able to track a shot across a model so precisely that you could do it twice. And when you put the film, because those are film cameras, you put the film camera into a scanner, it's within one scan line, the precision with which it's been able to do it. So that and things like, he also designed camera rigs that were used on climbing films. I think one of them was there was a film about the Eiger with people falling off it or not. And again, he designed the rigs that the cameras were set on. So anyway, Mark has got an Oscar, but his main claim to fame, as far as I'm concerned, is designing the head and designing this rig. So that was a pitch test where we're testing the pitch response beyond what a pilot can achieve in normal flight. So into negative angles of attack, so that if you get into a severe gust and you get into a negative angle of attack, which you can't achieve in flight normally, but we're able to test that on our test rig. It's much harder to do that job with a paraglider. The next thing we're about to do with the hang glider, which is load testing, is much easier to do with the paraglider. And we do exactly do this. The BHPA don't actually do paraglider load tests. Here we have the run up, get the absolute maximum amount of runway available, and with the glider set at its stalling angle of attack, because that's the maximum lift you can get, you drive the glider down the runway at, well, it's almost as fast as you can to achieve whatever the load the designer is looking for, or what load we're looking. Oh, that was a surprise, which it literally was. There was a combination of things going on here. If you look at it again, there's actually a wee bump in the runway there. Where that puddle is, there's a wee dent, and that was enough just to push it beyond his expected limit. Also, he is designing this one as a powered glider, and so he was aiming for more load than most free flight gliders would require. And in fact, it may have, when we post-process the data, it might have achieved the required load he was looking for, which is 6G. 6 times the load of the glider and the payload, the passenger or the pilot or the engine. So it's 6G plus 6 minus 3G, because we also do the tests literally in reverse, turn the glider around with its tail down and drive it into the wind backwards to make sure that it can withstand up to minus 3G. So yes, 6G is what it's looking for. So this was a column failure of the cross tubes, which are, you can see they're inside the sail here, but you can see them because they're in silhouette. One of the cross tubes on the right-hand side failed and buckled in the column. Yes, sorry.
Where is this?
Rufforth, centre of England-ish.
Right.
Yorkshire, yeah. Yep. So yes, a column failure of the cross tube was a design modification. Put a sleeve in the centre of the column to stiffen it up a bit more, and it was subsequently retested and it passed fine on its second test. So that's how we test hang gliders nowadays, to avoid the problems that Pilcher and Lilienthal had when they first started in the 1890s.
Are you involved in all that?
Yes, I've been the chairman of the Flying and Safety Committee of the BHPA for 30 years, forever, actually, literally, forever since it's existed. So I'm responsible for the equipment, for the standards, and the staff that are using it to do the testing. Yes.
Do you have international connections?
Yes, we do. Well, we used to. There are so few hang glider manufacturers left. I mean, once upon a time we had 3 hang glider manufacturers in Scotland, right? And now we've got basically 4 manufacturers in the world. We established a common set of standards between ourselves, the Germans, and the Americans, who were the 3 people who were testing gliders. And we discovered that although apparently our standards looked quite different at the start, when we got down to it, we discovered that really they turned out to be quite similar, and we were able to agree a common set of standards that were sufficiently close that our view was that if you can pass any one of our standards, you would be able to pass the others. However, the American Hang Gliding Manufacturers Association doesn't exist anymore because basically there aren't any American hang gliding manufacturers left. The one that was operating in California has now moved to Mexico. We think they took the test rig with them, but we don't know who's running it for them. The Germans have not had very many hang gliders to test for quite a long time, and we've recently heard that they did some re-instrumentation of their hang glider test rig, which is not the same as this one, because although they bought one identical to this, the guy who was in charge of their testing program didn't like it, and so they basically never really used it, and it's fallen into disrepair. So they continue to use their existing rig, which has recently been refurbished, and Moyes have told us that they think, well, that they're convinced that the results are not the same as they were before. So they want to come and test their glides with us in future because they think we'll give them a more consistent set of results. So we may end up actually as the only remaining hang gliding test facility in the world.
Nice, thank you. Yeah. The standards, are they global standards, or the standards vary by country to country?
There are, apart from in Germany and Austria, there are no mandated standards anywhere. Everybody else, including us, it's completely voluntary. You can choose to comply, but you don't have to. In the case of the BHPA, if you want to sell your gliders to people in the UK and have them certainly be insured while they're using them, then you would have to have them certified by us, the design certified by us. It's not every individual glider, it's the design that's certified. But there is no obligation on anybody to have them tested.
Right. Just to follow on to that, I mean, you're presumably, I'm assuming this is a new glider.
Yep,
so
this one's a new one. Yep.
A certification against UK standards for that glider. What happens when it's been flown 100 hours or 500 hours, or it's 5 years old, it's been stored? So it's the same question we all have.
Yep, and the answer is that that's the pilot's responsibility to look after the maintenance of their equipment. And they can send it back to the manufacturer, who still exists, well, Avian still do exist, and they will, they can strip it down and check it, which they do. But fundamentally, it's the pilot's responsibility to look after their own equipment. This is freedom. I mean, this is what it comes down to. We give you you can buy a design that has been tested. The design has been stress tested to +6 -3G. It's been tested to show that its pitch characteristics are better than ones that we know that caused issues in the past, because it's not a science that has said we know that the right answer is so much pitch moment, positive pitch moment at particular angles of attack. We tested gliders that people died flying, and they had low pitch recovery moments at these points. When they got negative angles of attack, they suddenly lost all their pitch, positive pitch recovery. So we set we said, here's what seems to look like, and stay away from the bit that's bad. And that's where we got our numbers from. The DHV took a rather more purist view on this. And their theory was that as long as the restoring pitch up moment, stayed positive at all angles of attack, that was a pass. It didn't matter how small it was or what its value was, as long as it stayed positive. Now, the flaw in this, I mean, that's arguably aerodynamically completely sound, but we're talking about flexible wings. No flexible wing ever has a completely monotonically positive increasing pitch moment. They just don't. And so the Germans fell back on, oh well, and then you've got to have a certain minimum, right? Force, right? And the problem with having a minimum force is that it doesn't scale, right? So small gliders have to have the same restoring force as large gliders, which penalizes small gliders. Now, we've always used pitching moments, which scale, right? So you don't have to. So smaller gliders have smaller forces, but they're proportional. But we've never managed to persuade the Germans that they should have moved to coefficients. They have stuck with forces.
What's the equivalent in paragliding? We don't have UK standards. Do we fall back on
Right.
the
We don't.
BHPA and whoever else?
We sort of started to have, in the days of the British Association of Paragliding Clubs, the BAPC, the precursor of the BHPA, they had developed some testing standards for paragliders, which were mostly about strength. Because originally, the original paragliders that were being used in the UK were literally round parachutes with slots in them so that they had a preferential direction of fall or glide. It's a bit of an exaggeration to call it a glider. So they had strength tests designed for paragliders of that type. But the main paragliding development was clearly happening in Europe, and the French were the first to get interested in trying to develop flight testing standards as well as load testing standards. And they developed a system that older people might remember called ACPULS, which predates the current SEN scheme. And at the same time, roughly, maybe slightly behind them, the DHV had developed a system that they used to test hang gliders and paragliders, but they labelled things DHV 1, 2, and 3. And the French decided that the Germans were being nationalistic about their application of their standards, and that French manufacturers, or other than German manufacturers, were at a big disadvantage when they turned up to get their gliders tested, because it appeared that the testing was all in the eye or the experience of the test pilot. Nobody could understand what it was that the test pilots were doing or why they were making particular judgments. Now, this was a bit unfair. The Germans did have a written down standard in German, funnily enough. They also did produce a translated version in English as well, subsequently. But a lot of it was subjective, written down to be the subjective view of the test pilot. And the manufacturers, particularly the French manufacturers, said this is not fair, right? We shouldn't be just dependent on subjectivity. We should try to be as objective as possible. And so they began a process to turn their standard, the ACPUL standard, into a European standard on the basis that if they did that, the Germans wouldn't be able to refuse to accept things that had been developed under this common European norm. And quite a long way into that process, we got involved. It was actually Walter Newmark who went on the committee originally, and then Mike and Steve may remember. Otto Walter von Neumark. Right? You may be able to guess where his family had originated from when he came over to England just before the Second World War, and was rather a remarkable individual who, amongst other things, invented the head-up display and gifted it to the RAF. People had used gun sights that you could look through before, but he was the first person to think of putting instrument displays, speed and artificial horizons, on the inside of a glass so that you could look through it. So that was one of his remarkable inventions. Another one was that he was the first person to make use of, he was always very keen on inflatable and pneumatic things. He invented inflatable hangars for aircraft, that you could inflate them very quickly in the middle of the desert or whatever. So I suppose the beginning of inflatable tents, that took a long time before they came along. But use of pneumatics, he invented the idea of the kind of mattresses that people in hospitals now lie on, where you've got multiple zigzags of pneumatic things which change the pressure, pulses, and different, the pressure, no pressure, pressure, no pressure. Sorry? Yes, and so he invented that. And he marketed his inventions under a company that he called Frankenstein. Now, he was taking the very literal, old-fashioned point of view that Frankenstein was the scientist who did all the research, right? But everybody now thinks Frankenstein was the monster, right? But anyway, so it perhaps wasn't the ideal name for his company. But anyway, Walter was a remarkable chap. He was the first person to be involved in the European standardisation, and I took over from him subsequently. So the French were well on their way to developing with UK and Italian and Swiss, but no involvement from Germany or Austria. Well on the way to developing the standard, and then almost at the last minute, the Germans went, "Oh, we don't agree with this." Yeah, but you had the opportunity to be involved. Why not? And we think that basically they sort of saw that there was that if they didn't get involved, there was the potential that their standard would become second-class standard. And so they did want to get involved. And the individuals who actually got involved in the committee were really good and very helpful, and they definitely improved the standard. So that allowed us to develop the current ABCD standard that you're all, I'm sure, familiar with. It's one European standard. It's the only standard. Nobody else has developed a standard, so anybody who's manufacturing paragliders and wants to sell them, in Germany they have to be certified, either under the European ABCD system or the ABCD system, yes, or the German exact equivalent ABCD system. But that's the only country, Germany and Austria, are the only two places in the world where if you don't have the official stamp of approval, you can't sell or fly the equipment. Sorry, that was a rather convoluted answer, Mike. Did it answer your question again?
You mentioned wind tunnels a couple of times. Obviously, that's like sort of replicating a wind tunnel. But you mentioned it with the Wright brothers. I take it that was like a scale model.
Yes, they were testing model gliders in when their wind tunnel was about this size, and they were really just interested in testing different amounts of curvature of the wing and to see how the drag and the lift were related to each other. But there are pictures, I haven't got an example of one, but there are pictures of full-sized hang gliders, or what we would recognise as a hang glider, being tested in the NASA Langley low-speed wind tunnel, which is big enough to have a full-sized hang glider hanging in it. But probably the only full-sized aircraft that's ever actually been put in a wind tunnel. It wasn't big enough. They were mostly putting models in, but in fact a full hang glider could be fitted inside it. Nope. Well, I think we're done. At this point, I didn't have quite so many questions along the way, but because I was showing it to non-flying people, I showed them a video that I took of flying my hang glider above Loch Tay, which Mike is familiar with because he was there when I landed. So that was to give that, and that has, people who've not done no flying at all have been very impressed and quite surprised at seeing Scottish scenery from that perspective. It was absolutely fabulous day. There were a few snow piles lying in the gullies, but the sky was clear with a nice sharp cloud base to it, and I had a really what a fabulous day flying. It's the first time I'd ever or maybe just the second time I'd ever put a camera in my glider, I've never got anywhere near as good a flight as that since. I haven't bothered trying to take any more, so it was the best by far. You can find it on YouTube if you want to search. I don't think we need to show it tonight, but you can find it on YouTube. Well, I'm done. Are there any questions? I'm happy to take any more questions, but otherwise, you're please.
Can I ask you about, I'm not expecting you to know this, but just in case you do. There seems to be, quite a big leap. You talked about 1899 and what happened with, I was ashamed about the two guys who fell. And then the Wright brothers started their epic sort of, but he talked about the Petriol and Rome.
Yes.
That they had all of a sudden came out of nowhere. So I'm thinking, where did it come from?
Well,
Where did that
okay.
come from?
So it didn't come out of nowhere,
Yeah.
but they were the first people to make it work successfully. They were, I think, really the first people to properly recognise how important control was. Right. Other people have said something similar, but I think that was their the key thing that separated them out from several other people who were working on trying to get powered aircraft flying at the time was that they realised that being able to control it was every bit as important as getting off the ground. Now, we had people in USA and in the UK building big things. Langley built a thing he called the aerodrome. It's a huge steam-powered thing with neither enough power, not enough lift, not enough control. So none of it was going to work. But the Wright brothers were very methodical. They fairly rapidly picked on, we could go back and look at it again, I suppose, an aerofoil that was going to provide enough lift to get them and their engine off the ground. They went for a biplane because it makes the structure easier to manage with more and yet more lift. And they recognised the benefit of 3-axis control, pitch, roll and yaw. They initially started out with pitch, as I showed on the picture, where their elevators were at the front of the pilot, but you're much more familiar with seeing it at the back. So that was one thing that they arguably got wrong, right? The other thing that they went for was warping the wing for roll control. Now that very rapidly people realised that structurally it was much better to build individual ailerons to adjust the angle of the flow over each wing. And so the Wright brothers, concept of wing warping didn't go very far, and their concept of having the tailplane out the front didn't last very long either. But the really critical bit was recognising that those 3 axes had to be sorted.
That I'm interested in.
Yep.
It seemed to have come out of nowhere, and that's why it was quite a leap for me to hear that in your presentation. I was just wondering.
Well,
who else they were building on.
Pilcher and Lilienthal and others all had tails on their gliders. They weren't really mobile tails, although there is some discussion about connecting the pilot's hips to the tail, so as when the pilot moved, you would get the tail turning as well. That was experimented with, but they were so focused, in a sense, on trying to get the gliders to fly that they thought they would sort the control out afterwards. Wright brothers were amongst the first to recognise that getting the controls sorted really was critical. And if you couldn't manage that, then actually you were hiding to nothing.
In fact, some of what you've said here about the testing is based on that idea that all of these things affect how strong the glider is going to be. So you have to actually, that's maybe how some of the failures happen, just the way that they...
Well, they had no way of testing them other than literally doing flight. They didn't.
They allowed them to get out of the right sort of...
Yes, indeed. Well, the pitch testing is an interesting one to me as an aeronautical engineer. That it was a long time before some hang glider pilots accepted that they were not able to tell from the feel of the glider in the air whether this glider was pitch stable or not. But they're only able to test it within a really narrow range of angles of attack. And when you get into real air, as paragliding pilots know, you encounter bits of turbulence that are doing things
Maybe the answer is the focus of 2 major people in the field dying in a 10-year period.
Well, it's a 3-year period. Three-year period, and I don't think it was, because neither of them really were killed because of lack of control. One of them was probably pitch stability, really, because a stall followed by not recovering before you hit the ground means you haven't really got enough pitch stability. And the other one was structural failure, which was a continuing hazard, especially when you're building things out of bits of wood. So, yeah, they had not...
When you moved the glider, apologies
Yeah,
for not knowing the detail, I'm not an aeronautical engineer, but when you talked about your tests,
Yes.
you moved the angle of attack,
Yes.
and all that, I was assuming that I'm changing the angle of attack changes how much it can withhold the pressure. I think when the thing failed, it was because of a bump in the road there.
Well, it was very close to failure because of the load. And yes, you're right, the bump sort of tipped over the edge.
And then that tipped over.
Well, it was set at the same angle of attack for that. All those load tests are done with the glider at the angle of attack that gives maximum lift, which is just a fraction before it stalls. If you go any higher than that, you get turbulent flow behind the wing and it doesn't create as much lift. So you set it for the load test at the angle of attack that will give you maximum lift. Now, when you're flying as a glider, that never really happens because you've always got to be in balance, well, except in a turn, or dynamically for a very short period of time. You always have to be in balance so that the weight of gravity is being balanced by the lift that the glider is producing. When we're driving down the runway with 6G of force in effect, or net, 6 times the weight of the glider and the pilot. So
does that angle of attack affect how much you can cope with that?
No, the angle of attack, the lower the angle of attack, the less lift force is generated at the same speed. The maximum lift force is generated at the stalling angle of attack. And then after that, it gets less again. Right? So basically what we're doing is we're doing 2 different kinds of tests. One of them is with the glider at a fixed angle of attack, fixed at the angle of attack that has given us the maximum lift in the previous tests, right? And we do that one by increasing the speed and increasing the speed until it breaks. The real expectation is that it will break at some point. We're just interested in how much more than 6G it can take. In this particular case, it was maybe just slightly less because of the bump, but the manufacturer's conclusion was it was worth putting a little bit of sleeving in just to reduce that, give them a bigger bit of margin. The pitch tests are done by driving at constant speed, not high speed, and you start with the glider with its nose below the horizon, below the angle of attack, negative angle of attack, so that the lift is downwards, not upwards, right? And that you can't get into that position in the normal circumstances when you're flying. In the same, a paraglider it's even harder because obviously if you get the nose of the paraglider down, as soon as you get negative lift, it collapses, right? Which is both a weakness and a strength at the same time. But in the case of a hang glider, it stays in its shape, and you can have negative lift, downwards forcing lift. If you're flying in a glider, when that happens, you feel you've gone weightless, because the glider's going down faster than you, right? Faster than gravity's pulling you down, and so you go slack. Your straps go slack. You feel weightless. The wings go boing. The wires go slack. And what you're hoping is that because of the testing and what the manufacturers have done, is that even although the force is downwards, there's still a rotating force bringing the nose back up again, so that you don't go all the way down into the ground, which is what did used to happen to hang gliders. We had a fairly high-profile fatality in Scotland, which happened on a pilot who was effectively test flying a glider that hadn't been on the test rig, and he was flying in quite turbulent conditions, and he was flying quite fast, and basically pulled on more speed, and then the glider just wouldn't come out of the dive until it used to be known as a luffing dive in old Regalo days, before we had devices to keep the trailing edge up so as to provide a bit of restoring force.
See, I was thinking, because I knew that the early hang gliders are doing that dive and that the new ones
Yes.
were, but I was thinking that chap would died with the Hill, the Scottish guy.
Yes.
I was thinking that basically he was in one of these gliders that was just like nose dive. Do you know, I just thought that that's what happened. And whether it was recorded at the time that he just like, that's what, it was never recovering. If
we're talking about the same one, Rafe Bygott, then the glider he was flying was not sufficiently pitch stable.
I was talking about the early guy, Pilcher.
Oh right, well he died in England, right, and right,
guy.
yes, his half Scottish, to be strictly accurate, and his glider crashed because the tail broke, and it no longer, the lift was kind of being divided between the wings and the tail. And when the tail broke, it just basically fell out of the sky.
When you hit a negative G on a paraglider, on a hang glider, do you just have no control at that point because you have no weight shifts?
Well, up to some extent, yes, that's true. The best thing is to keep hold of the control bar, which is not necessarily easy when you're suddenly moving the other direction than you expect, and to try and get your weight forward. Because that is the most stable position for any aircraft, to have its centre of gravity forward. But if you just leave a hang glider alone, right, then we expect, because of the testing we've done and the standards we've set, that it will actually recover.
What what's the kind of maximum G force that you'd expect in flight that you can actually generate when you're flying? Can you generate up to 6G, or do you not have that authority?
I don't think so. 2G feels like a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever pulled more than 2G in a glider, which I know is stressed to 6.
Yeah. So there is acro in
There is, yes, and we know that people have broken gliders, mostly not in positive G, mostly because they've failed a loop or an acro manoeuvre and they've ended up upside down. And then the pilot falls into the frame and it's stressed to less than half as much. And in some cases, these weren't very new gliders as well. So the point you were making about how do you know that they're still as good as they were when they're new? Well, they aren't. And we have had side wires failing through fatigue and lack of awareness and maintenance. So yes, but fundamentally it's, but there's no alternative. Well, okay, you either try and set rules, which but there aren't any rules for there's no way to apply these rules or to make them stick. So the best rules we've got are try and get the design sorted out at the start, and then advice to people that they do need to look after them and maintain them and change their side wires after it depends how skinny they are and how much stress they put on them, but let's say every year or every other year after maybe 100 hours of flight. We do end up with odd things like people like the look of stainless steel. It's nice and shiny, but it's also much less fatigue resistant than galvanized iron, steel. So the messy looking galvanized steel wires actually have a longer life than stainless ones have.
Where do you see the evolution of hang gliding going? Is it so established now that it's evolved to sort of?
Well, the thing I haven't talked about at all, which Michael would be disappointed, and Steve too as well, is rigid wing hang gliders, where we've reached pretty much a plateau of performance on flex wing gliders. By the time you have wrapped most of the gubbins inside the sail, and you've given the pilot the ability to make the whole frame and sail tighter in flight, pulling on your VG cord, which makes it flatter and more difficult to turn, but it glides better in between, so you get more like the albatross and less like the buzzard. There isn't really any much way to go. You still require flexibility about the structure, otherwise you can't make it turn. That's what the turning's all about. So the only way to go beyond that is if you accept aerodynamic controls, then you can make the wing completely stiff, and that's the kind of glider that mine flies. An Atos, a very impressive bit of sail planery that you're still hanging underneath and you can carry by yourself. But it kind of is more, in some respects, in its flying characteristics, not the way the pilot is the pilot's underneath it in the same way that hang glider pilots have always hung underneath their gliders, but its performance is beginning to more resemble that of a sailplane. There is still some flexibility about the structure because it's got fabric, but the leading edge is a D-cell, which is effectively solidly rigid, and it's got spoilers on the tops of the wing to provide the control. Now, what we saw Tim Swaite in the bottom right-hand corner briefly. What he's working on at the moment is a kind of partly educated by computational fluid dynamic, computer programs to model flow, and some interesting ideas about how to improve the structure and design of gliders. The first thing that he's done is he's built some winglets, which he has used computer design to optimize. They're not expected to produce extra lift for the glider, which is what they're on airliners for primarily. They allow them to have more lift as if their wings were longer, but not actually making the lift. In this case,
as opposed to reducing drag.
They're basically one and the same thing. You've achieved a higher aspect ratio, which means lower drag for the same lift, but you do it without having to have such long wings. And by turning them up, they're not quite as effective as making the wings as much longer as they are, but they're nearly as effective as making the wings. But the structure is simpler because you get less bending moments applied. When you've got a vertical bit of wing, it no longer is bending the wing root as you're flying along, but it is producing some improvement in efficiency. What Tim has been doing is designing winglets for hang gliders that produce more yaw stability. Now, I spoke about adverse yaw occurring. The first thing that happens when you try and turn a hang glider is it nose actually goes the wrong way. And this is a bit of a problem when you're being towed rapidly behind a tug, a microlight, or for that matter, a winch. So he's built some winglets which do appear to have maybe marginal benefit in performance on the glider, but that wasn't his primary aim. His primary aim was to try and improve the kind of straight line stability, and he's convinced that that has worked well. So that's one enhancement, but he's working on a fairly significantly different internal structure design of glider, incorporating some new ideas, which we don't expect. He calls it the 7th generation, right? Well, why not? I'm not sure. That's not going to produce a huge change. The step change from current topless flex wing hang gliders are the rigid wings, the like of which Mike's flying.
And are they still weight shift controlled, or how do you control the spoilers?
Yes and no. It's the same action, although it's a bit simpler. Without going into detail of it, but it's basically to turn it, you move side to side, but you're not weight shifting. It's the control frame that's moving, which moves the side wires, which are connected to the spoilers.
So you held rigidly under the glider, and then you're just moving basically.
You're just hanging in the harness, exactly the same.
So in a conventional hang glider, as I've been talking about, the frame is rigid, right? So when you push against that frame, you move, right? And relatively speaking, the frame also moves.
Right.
In Mike's glider, the frame is not rigid. The control frame is not rigidly held in place.
Is it held rigid for pitch?
Yes, it is. It's held forward to back. It's held rigid, but not in roll. So that when he pushes himself to the side, he doesn't move very much, if at all. What happens is that the side wires move and lift a spoiler on the relevant side.
So the side wires underneath the structure.
Yeah.
So you're kind
As
of
they are in a flex.
Yeah.
But you're still hanging from a single point.
Yes,
Right. Okay.
and still using weight shift for pitch control.
It's always amazes me how well they fly in terms of efficiency, because it's quite an inefficient thing to induce a turn by sticking a spoiler up on top of the middle of the wing.
Great on the section.
Yeah.
How do they? Oh, you still pitch. Okay.
it's inefficient because what's creating drag or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
You're killing the lift on the sides that you want to turn into.
No, well, why didn't they make the other one?
And is it?
Why didn't they?
Well, they did that with one, and
It turns out to be, it's adequately efficient, right, to have spoilers. Is I think the answer. Theoretically, yes, ailerons would be more efficient, but they're harder to engineer. The spoilers are really relatively easy to engineer, and they work. An aileron is at the trailing edge of the wing. If you look out the side of your EasyJet or your sailplane, yeah.
the thing you can get away with a rigid, because it's actually easier to turn, because it's not just, you're not flexing the wing, you're using control surfaces, so you can have more span.
Right.
Quite a lot more span.
Significantly longer.
So you're more. Are you killing the lift over the wing, or are you creating
One section of the wing, roughly in the middle of the side that you want to turn towards, you kill the lift. Well, of course, it depends how hard you pull on the controls in a paraglider. But yes, it's a little bit like that. Although the point of action on a paraglider is the trailing edge, whereas in one of these rigid wing gliders, the point of action is kind of like halfway from the leading edge to the trailing edge. On the top of the leading edge, there's this flap can be raised, and it doesn't get raised all the way most of the time. It's just a little bit of drag, additional drag, and that's enough to cause the turn to start.
Is it just on the top of the wing? Or
On the top,
leading edge?
just the top
The very top.
top surface, just behind the leading edge.
It also
Sorry, I haven't got any pictures to show.
be said that certainly the competition hang gliders now, top misses, the noise, they're incredibly good. But compared to a rigid, I would say they are just as good in the hands of a really good pilot.
Yes.
But the difference being for me that to get the best out of a top flex wing, you have to be a really good pilot. Even though they are remarkably easy to fly, but to fly them really well, you have to be a really good pilot. Whereas you get away with a lot in a rigid because it's easier to fly. You don't need that.
He says, falsely modestly, right?
Do any have tails? Or are they?
There's been quite a few experiments done with tails on flex-wing hang gliders, and some manufacturers favour them. But the key, I didn't really talk about them. One of the things I didn't talk about was where does the pitch stability come from in a hang glider? If we go back into back in here, and then we go into, let's see, so I can point at it on my own glider. Let's not start from the first slide. Let's put this one up here. There we are, that one. It's not ideal to look at this one, but start from the current slide. There we are. Right. So this is an avian, same manufacturer as it happens. Evo, it's called. And as I've already said, all the kind of gubbins is inside the wing. That hanging there, that's actually my gloves. It's nothing to do with the glider, right? But the key I was going to talk about is that you could probably, well, here's where the pilot is suspended. I mean, I'm carrying the glider on the control frame, but my hang point is just there. So that's the centre of lift of the wing there. And out here, the tips are behind me. Right? If I put the keel on the ground, that's when the tips touch the ground as well. So the tips are quite a long way behind me, and they are set so that the angle of attack at the tips is such that as you slow down the centre section of the glider, the tips keep flying. So they're still generating lift even when you reach the point of the stall at the centre of the section. The wingtips are still flying, and they therefore are automatically producing a force which is tipping the nose back down again. So the combination of sweep, which is the way that the wingtips are behind the pilot, and this washout I've just described, where there's a different angle of attack between here and here, those are the two things that give you pitch stability in hang glider wings. Exactly the same in Mike's rigid wing. It's just a bit more subtle because the wing is rigid, and so it doesn't have to withstand flexing of it, and so it's built in and it looks less obvious. Paragliders also have washout, although it's not nearly so obvious as in hang gliders. But that's the idea, being you would prefer that a stall happened first right in the middle, and the rest of it we keep flying and keep and stay up, rather than all collapse at once. But of course, the problem is the air doesn't always cooperate. If we had some way of generating standardized turbulence, that's what we would try and test paragliders in, but there is no way to do that. So the best we're able to do is to have test pilots put gliders into similar shapes as we observe them happening in turbulent air. And when we first developed the current ABCD system, nobody had manufactured a glider that would pass A class. And some people said it wouldn't be possible, because as an example of the kind of relative extreme that we went to, we said a 75% asymmetric collapse on an A-class glider should leave the glider flying in pretty much a straight line, which sounds ridiculous. 3/4 of the wing is gone, and you still want it to fly in pretty much a straight line. And people said, I can't possibly do that. But actually, it turns out you can. Given the right challenge, manufacturers can produce remarkably, really impressive bits of equipment that will indeed survive remarkable amounts of turbulence.
Well, thanks for just driving all that. I mean, it's incredible to have these brilliant standards. You know that your glider, you can put it. I did an SIV last year. You put it into something that flies out of itself.
Yes.
I mean, I would say
Well, mostly to the test pilots. I mean, yes,
the
standards have.
Setting that standard
Yeah.
is what has pushed.
It has. It definitely has. what we're currently working on is that we've recognised that glider designers are really smart, right? I mean, they're all really smart. And they recognised very quickly that they were selling more B-class gliders than anything else, because pilots don't want to think that they're beginners, and so they want to get out of A as soon as possible. I wish I could persuade people that this is a big mistake, that actually many people would be better off flying on an A-class glider because they'd enjoy it more, because they would be worried less often. They wouldn't have to keep their currency up. The glider would look after them more. But they're determined to get into B, and because they were selling lots of B-class gliders, then they wanted to sell better Bs that were nearly Cs, right? And so then we ended up with a really broad range of Bs, from Bs that are only just not As to Bs that are very nearly Cs, and that's quite a big spread. And so our current scheme is trying to divide the B class into two, the high Bs and low Bs. And we think we've got a... Yeah, well, we are. I mean, we've yes, you're right. But there's nothing objective about that just now. The current descriptions of high Bs and low Bs has just come from manufacturers and pilots with no objective measurement that says this one falls into the high B category versus the low B category. We've worked out that when we test gliders accelerated and unaccelerated, some of the tests are done accelerated and unaccelerated, that gliders that will get a B when on an accelerated test are generally speaking high Bs. And gliders that still get As on accelerated tests are usually low Bs, and that's kind of where the distinction is going to be drawn. So I'm reasonably optimistic that a low B glider is going to be a good place for most people to be. Sorry, but pun not intended. Right?
Where do you see the new Arrowings coming into the system? Is that going to follow the same glider classification, or is that going to...
It takes the problem is the amount of sales, the number of designs, and the time scale it takes to develop a standard. It takes a very long time, not least because every time on at least 3 occasions I could name, we've come up with things that we thought sounded really good. And then we've sent the test pilots off to test them, and they've come back and said, this doesn't work. So think again, right? It's not directly to do with the gliders, this is to do with parachutes, which we also set standards for parachutes and harnesses and gliders. The load tests for gliders, which are shock and load tests. The shock is done by laying out the glider on the runway behind the truck and driving the truck, accelerating the truck really fast, and having I was going to call it a weak link, but it's a really strong link that's to fail and check that the glider hasn't been damaged. And then the load test is done under driving the truck down the runway and making sure that they can take 12G for more than a certain amount of time. Anyway, they haven't changed. They seem to be working very well. The flight test is a bit different. But parachutes, the easiest way to make a low descent rate parachute is to build a wing, because wings have got lower descent rates if you measure them vertically than parachutes do. And so this is what manufacturers were doing. They were building parachutes that glided. And we said, well, that's all very well, but these are supposed to be parachutes. And the problem with a gliding parachute is that on average, if there's a wind blowing, you're going to hit the ground with 1.5 times as much energy as if it had come straight down. Because if you happen to have it flying into the wind, yes, you'll hit the ground softer, but if it's flying with the wind, you'll hit the ground harder, and even at 45 degrees off, it still hits the ground harder. The net effect is you hit the ground with more energy with a gliding parachute than you do with a vertical parachute. So, okay, how can we tell if this is a gliding parachute or a parachute? And we thought, oh, it's easy, right? If it's got a glide angle of more than 1:1, 45 degrees, it's a glider. And if it's got a glide angle of less than 1:1, it's a parachute. Easy. Should be easy to tell if it's coming down with maybe a streamer of smoke or a literal streamer, from the test mass that's being used to test the parachute, we'll be able to tell. Or you could instrument them and measure. We don't care how you do it. This is what you. So the test houses went away and they came back nearly a year later and said, right, we've tried smoke, we've tried streamers, ribbons, we've tried measurement, and you just can't tell. You can't distinguish. You do the test 3 times and you get 3 different answers. So we went, damn it. That was a good idea. Let's tear that one up and start again. So nowadays, we always have to make sure that we have tested the tests before we finalise them. And where we're at just now, we're about to organise a testing session for the test pilots from Aerotest, the French testing laboratory, from Air Turquoise, the Swiss testing laboratory, and the DHV, the German testing laboratory. We want to get all the test pilots together to test the new tests that we've come up with. And that is difficult. Finding a time when they're all available, when the weather cooperates, or a site that we can get, and to have a nicely defined set of test flying manoeuvres that we want them to do takes ages. So it's taken us years to get to where we are, and we still have to do the tests before we can ratify it. It's frustratingly slow. It really is.
Parawing is works similar to kite surfing kites. So instead of having a break at the back, you're changing your angle of attack. So the new mustache, the flow mustache. That's a spin-off of a kite surfing company. That was one of the designers for the kite surfing company. He basically took one of their foil kites and put a paraglider
harness under, or risers. Riser under, yes.
You can fly it on standings, but you can dive. You have an extra axis of control, basically. So
as the saying goes, what could possibly go wrong now?
they're getting very popular. They're generally like a reflex airfoil. So they're pretty stable, I guess, until they're not. But you can pull them right. There's videos of people like pulling them right in front of them, almost touching the ground, and then just pop back up again. But yeah, you've got a huge amount of control in your speed and your angle of attack on them. And then once you pull, so hands up is like basically full sweep bar, kind of similar situation. And as you come down, it flattens out. And then as you come further than that, you've got a little pulley that engages, and that turns it into braking instead of changing gear, so you can still flare at the end. So it's quite similar, very similar system to the kite surfing
I've
kites.
seen people do it, but only over water and videos. I think
Well,
I don't know if I've
Mark Shaw has one, and he quite enjoys flying his mustache.
seen
Oh yes, the swooping. Yes, yeah.
That you were just describing then. I've seen it on videos where they kind of like they scoot right down and then they go way back up and then they go land. They've not got much time, but they're landing on the beach or whatever. But that's it.
Chris you met, he flies one, but it's the speed swing version, so it's an 11 meter version of this.
Who's again?
We met him a couple of times. He was here. He's been to a few of these.
Oh yeah. I met him.
Chris Airwoods. He did a talk on speed flying.
Are they basically doing what the Wright brothers did, putting the control at the front rather than the back? Is that what they're doing?
No, it is more about allowing the angle of attack to be changed, which is what a speed system does in a paraglider. It basically pulls down the leading edge. This is a more extreme version of that, with a wing that's...
But to dive, you're actually forcing a dive.
You're basically just throwing your speed bar on.
And some, yeah.
Much further.
Right.
So hands up is full speed bar, basically. Down here is kind of regular paraglider, and then you've got your brake travel.
So you don't need to do a spiral dive anymore.
No, you can just
You can basically dive out.
yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, and you can regain height, so you can shoot along, and then you can climb back up just with converting your momentum to
What's
your energy.
stops them collapsing?
Yeah.
When you go
They're
maximum speed bar on.
a reflex profile which seems to stabilize themselves a bit more, but I'm not really
It's
sure.
a combination of maybe internal pressure and a floppy tail end to the glider.
Really,
So
I don't know. Do you
I'm
think-
not exactly sure. No, I haven't really studied them. I'm struggling enough with ordinary
Is it still a
paragliders.
kind of ram air
Yes, it is. Oh, yes, it's not.
They
It's
look,
not.
They look like a
I
regular
mean,
paraglider.
what-
Just the riser is different.
One of the things I get asked fairly regularly is why do we don't have inflated paragliders? You know, a bit like my Walter Newmark's inflatable, things. And in fact, this particular came out with a discussion about using kites to pull ships, right? And which some experiments have been done with. And yes, you can absolutely inflate the structure of a kite that you're going to use to fly a ship. But the problem with an aircraft is you gain height and the pressure drops. And that's not too much of a problem for relating some of the pressure out. It's a bit more difficult to get it back in again as you come back down, right? And it seems to that concept catches people out a bit, right?
Was it the whoopie fly?
Yes, yeah, there was a whoopie fly, yes. It needed a little fan running to keep all the time. Yeah, keep it at constant pressure.
Some of the manufacturers were no longer existing in the UK.
Hang gliding manufacturers, yep.
Yeah. Does that not cause you a bit of concern?
Yes, but we're not in a position to be economic regulators. If there aren't enough people wanting to do it, then
I'm just
yeah.
thinking of like the development of the wings themselves. You know, if you've not got that many manufacturers of it.
Well, we've got one basically in the UK now.
Also the massive market.
Well,
So,
yeah,
paragliders
yeah,
throw
yes.
money into it, don't they?
Well, that's what I was sort of getting at.
There's
You
not
know,
the return.
if you had if it was a big enough market.
There's only one rigid wing manufacturer in the world. One.
Is there
Iratos.
is there much going into kind of evolving them to be more compact and portable
Yes.
and-
My friend Mark West, who I mentioned, who designed the test rig that we use, he now lives in Norway, having emigrated there and with a new family. And he has been working for several years now on a new hang glider design that he intends to be. Two key features of it are that it should be more portable, both weight and size, and it should be sufficiently aeroelastic that it cannot be overstressed, because basically when the load gets above a certain point, it flexes enough that it, a bit like birds, right? Birds can't really get overstressed unless they hit something, because basically their wings just, bend and their feathers bend. So he's been working on a glider design which is built of titanium and carbon fibre, and he has built himself a new test rig with a test rig head that will not just measure lift, drag and pitching moment, but will also measure yaw and roll, because he wants to test his glider thoroughly before he flies it. Now it's taking him a long time, but that is what he's working on. Tim Swaite is working on what he called the 7th generation. It has more folding up capability, folds up a bit shorter than, but there are limits, because basically, as we're kind of discussing, the more efficient you want the wing to be, the longer you need the leading edges to be, and that's one of the key limits, is how big a garage you've got to put it in, and how big your car is. Well, that as well, Steve. Yes, absolutely. They are very expensive.
It's not always been the problem with hang gliders, the logistics, transportation and all the rest of it.
It's the key benefit of paragliders, undoubtedly. They're so much more transportable, lighter to carry, easier to store. Get them on a bus, get them on a train. Thank you. Good night.
That's very good, Angus.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you for all the interactivity and all the questions. That always helps.
You've convinced me, but I'm glad I never get involved in that.